Thanks for the introduction. Today, I'll start a little bit with my background, how I got here to IBM Research Africa, located in Nairobi, Kenya. Then I will highlight the work we are doing on AI for global health, and I'll go into one example based on COVID-19, in which AI was leveraged to help support the scientific community. I grew up in the US, in Maryland, actually, in the United States. And I went to undergraduate university in Atlanta, Georgia at Clark Atlanta University, where I studied computer science. I had always enjoyed more of digital physical interaction, robotics, all of those types of systems. And so I decided to pursue a PhD in robotics at MIT. I worked on, both multi-robot, single robot systems. And also while I was at MIT, I had the opportunity to work on 3 projects in Africa. 2 projects in Ghana. One was around teaching computer science and entrepreneurship, and the other was Africa's very first deployment of a fab lab. A fab lab is essentially a suite of digital fabrication tools like laser cutter, milling machines, 3D printing, and so forth. And then I also had an opportunity to work on a project in Kenya around incorporating IT into the education curriculum there. So the combination of both my experiences as a PhD student studying computer science and artificial intelligence at MIT, and specifically in robotics, along with this tremendous opportunity to work in Africa, really led me to just want to be on the continent of Africa, collaborating with other scientists and advancing the state of the art. And so as I knew I wanted to be abroad, I had the opportunity after I graduated to work in Spain for a couple of years. And then once IBM Research opened a lab in Africa and I saw it on LinkedIn, I immediately, signed up, and basically the rest is history. So essentially I joined IBM Research Africa just as the lab was being open. So part of the work that I lead currently is really around developing AI tools to accelerate progress towards global health targets. And this work is in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we are and have developed a suite of tools in the AI space to help address these key global health challenges, from malaria elimination, maternal, newborn, and child health, family planning, and COVID-19 response. In case, let me just summarize a few of these, and then I'll go into the COVID one. So for malaria elimination, we've actually developed a very nice environment and platform in which modelers, policymakers, and AI algorithm developers can come together and leverage reinforcement learning, planning, and optimization techniques to help with intervention planning for malaria elimination. And we did this in collaboration with the IHME, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, and the Uganda National Malaria Control Program team as well. In the maternal, newborn, child space and child health space, we're really focusing on understanding vulnerable populations. So we applied methods from subset scanning that allow for automated discovery of subgroups that are disproportionately affected by either an intervention or have a higher than average outcome. And in the family planning space, we applied methods from sequence mining, as well as in some deep neural network methods to understand the sequences of contraceptive use within populations across many African countries. And lastly, in the COVID-19 response, we actually reused the malaria elimination platform and work, and we've combined that with some newer work that I'll talk about today the non-pharmaceutical interventions tracker in order to provide tools to the scientific community for understanding, control, and response to the disease. Great, so that's what I'll focus on now. So basically, as the kind of pandemic started, we really had a number of questions on our mind. And at the very, very beginning, we wanted to just understand what is actually happening, what are the government's responses around the world as the pandemic was starting to unfold. We didn't even know what are all the options and tools that are now considered a set of non-pharmaceutical interventions that are being used and how they're, if they are effective. So some key questions are, what is the optimal set of NPIs? Those are non-pharmaceutical interventions to implement when, where, and for how long to reduce the spread of COVID-19. How well is the population adhering to the NPIs that are imposed? How has screening and treatment of non-COVID-19 conditions been affected by NPIs? And even questions that are personal questions like, how does school opening in the neighboring district affect disease spread in your own district? So these were like big challenging questions that we had as researchers within IBM Research, but also that a number of organizations had. And just to start to address them, we needed to collect data and understand, what was available and out there. So to do that, we created the WinTrack data set. So it's the Worldwide Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions Tracker data set. It now has over 7,000 NPIs that have been implemented in response to COVID-19 by governments worldwide. So we cover over 261 regions. And we update it frequently about every couple of weeks. To keep track and update the most relevant changes from an NPI perspective, whether they've been lifted or whether they've been imposed. So the way that we actually approached this was to start by using Wikipedia as a source. Believe it or not, they have hundreds of pages that are dedicated by geography specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can take those articles and the information within those articles and start to extract out the NPIs from there. So here's just an example of a sentence. On March 23rd, Governor Cuomo closed all K-12 public schools statewide through May 15th and bans mass gatherings over 50 people. In this case, you actually see there's two events in this sentence. There's the closing of the K-12 schools, and the second is the banning of mass gatherings over 50 people. So you want to be able to extract that information out and put it in a structured form where now you have information within like a CSV in our case, by region or location, by date, whether or not it's a restriction or it's being lifted. What is the type of event? So we have a taxonomy of types of events. The value in this case for mass gatherings, it was a value of 50 people. The source of the information, so the Wikipedia article and any additional sources that can corroborate, including like executive orders. So this gives structured information in terms of what NPI events were actually imposed, and that allows for downstream further analysis by the scientific community. So again, the idea was to just understand what were the government responses that were happening. Another example here is just showing that within some of these Wikipedia articles that do actually change every day, you can have these different levels. So we had school closure in the previous one. In this case, you can have school closure. It could be just universities. It could be just preschools. So you have this different levels of information, and our data set managed to capture those different levels. And just to give you a high-level summary, these are the main categories that we converged on that we would focus on in order to collect this data set. So the core three areas that we saw from that are, of NPI events being implemented around the world, from isolation, such as work restrictions, freedom of movement, mass gatherings, activity cancellation like schools, sporting events, restaurants, various hygiene like mask wearing and so forth, as those were imposed. And again, the way we determined the data source was whether or not it was a government announced and not necessarily, just a community decision. So these are kind of the official announcements. Now, what we did is we created this process to automatically gather this data from the Wikipedia articles by geography. And let me describe it. So first of all, what I think is key here is that natural language processing is in the loop. We do have other data sets, including from Oxford and a few others that are also collecting NPI events around the world, but they had a large force of volunteers that would comb various websites and other information in order to create a data set. And that might not be scalable for the long term, of course, keeping that volunteer force. And then, what about future pandemics? How do we reuse some technical capabilities? So in our case, by bringing NLP in the loop, it made it scalable and reduced the number of people required. So we do still keep humans in the loop. I think that's important for validation. But let me describe the overall process. So you have on the left non-pharmaceutical interventions that are announced by a government, and they come in through various unstructured sources, whether it's a PDF or a press release or through social media. Then through some crowdsourcing, you'll actually find that the crowd that actually curates and updates Wikipedia is updating those pages by geography. In our case, we leveraged that top tier shown there on the track from a natural language processing perspective, whereas in other approaches that created such data sets, they went from the volunteer team that you see at the bottom in the crowdsourcing box straight to events. So we use natural language processing from Wikipedia, and then that actually allows us to have candidate events. And those candidate events are validated by a small team of just a couple people. And then out comes the structured summary and database of non-pharmaceutical events, again, to be used in downstream analysis, whether it's modeling, impact, and so forth. So that was a key element of our work. The differentiator there and how AI could actually make a difference. And throughout this process, basically we crawl, a few hundred Wikipedia pages every night through an completely automated service. We use the NLP pipeline to extract candidate events. And then we use what we call a curator tool that allows for others to validate NPI events, and then the data is pushed into our GitHub. Note, all of this pipeline, everything is completely available open source, from the NLP to the data set to even the analysis that we've been doing. And I'll share those links. So this is just giving you a high level of the processing pipeline. I don't necessarily want to spend too much time in there. You can actually go to the code, if you see the link there, and visit the website to get the details that describe all of this process. We also published this work as well, so I'll discuss that. I'll mention that in a little bit. This is just an example of the curator tool. So once candidate NPI events are generated through the NLP pipeline, this is the tool that faces the validators to sort of, it pre-populates based on the best guess, and then allows the validators to simply say, here's the the sentence or the source from Wikipedia, does what we found here corroborate with that source? And then, that gets put into the database through that process. So, so some of the key tools that are available now, you can find everything on the WinTrack dataset website. So the one on the left, everything will be there. Like I said, all the code and the data are available open source and freely available. We also have a complementary data browser that allows you to explore the various NPI events that have been captured over time, as well as it has a tab on a notion of adherence. So this index for adherence that we developed is a complementary index to what Oxford had developed around the stringency index, to try to have a better understanding of how the population is actually adhering to the NPIs over time. So we do actually use mobility data from the Google mobility data set. And then at the bottom, we publish this work in Nature Scientific Data, so you can reference it, and all the information can also be found there as well. Now I will just highlight a few different just high-level descriptive analysis. The core element of this, of course, was the whole pipeline for NLP to create this process. But from there, you want to start asking some questions. So these are some broad questions that we were asking late last year. And so I'll just summarize a couple of things. So looking at the popularity of the types of NPIs that were imposed in the US versus worldwide. And the US is blue here, and worldwide is this orange color. So it turns out in US territories, the top three that were really imposed were state of emergency, work restrictions, and entertainment or cultural sector closure at that time. Of course, this graph evolves over time, so we keep that up to date on our website as well. And for worldwide regions, the main NPIs were around mask wearing, international flight restriction, and freedom of movement. And then at that point in time, you can see the US states had 25% of states and territories mandating mask wearing, and worldwide it was much larger. So that's just one example. Another brief example was just looking at the duration, like how long NPI events were implemented or imposed over time. It's actually a little bit difficult because there's not a one-to-one mapping between an NPI announcement or event and when it's lifted. For example, all schools might be closed, but then universities might be opened a few months later, and then maybe preschools are opened. And so there's not a one-to-one. So this is just, kind of a high level understanding here. But most interestingly, looking at the US versus worldwide, the introduction of travel quarantine policy had the longest duration for worldwide. Work restrictions were imposed for similar duration in the US and worldwide. And then mask wearing was the shortest in duration in both the US and in worldwide. So this is just some of the analysis that you can do when you access the data set and even explore further. And briefly, we're starting to look at, not only just the NPIs, we start to relate it to other COVID-19 outcomes. In this case, it is the first reported number of 50 cases. Note that all of this obviously has noise around it, and the first death. So we took a sample of countries and said, let's make two categories. Let's put a set of NPIs and call them community related, and then another set of NPIs and call them travel related. And within those two sets, how long did it take for those countries to respond with respect to their first reporting of 50 cases and their first reporting of a death? For example, in South Africa, so going as the number line goes to the left, it's the number of days before, 0 being the start point for where the pandemic hit. So in that country, in South Africa, for example, they had implemented community-related NPIs up to even 40 days prior to the first 50 cases, and then even earlier prior to their first death, to when the first death occurred. Then on the travel-related NPIs, for example, you can start to see like Brazil and New York, actually, they are after zero. So they actually imposed travel-related NPIs after their first 50 reported cases, and just about after the first deaths, whereas some other countries did it before. So again, this is just combining our data set with other COVID outcome data sets and starting to ask questions there. And then lastly, we created a notion of adherence and an index for it. Again, that's described in detail in our paper, and also is, you can actually play with it on the website and compare it and contrast it to the Oxford Stringency Index. But our notion of adherence, we wanted to use the Stringency Index, and the Stringency Index really represented how let's say, strong the government response was. So separate from what the population was doing, it's really more of a measure of the response. And then we also combine it with the mobility data in order to see basically what the actual population is doing on the ground. So this is Google's mobility data report. So there's a baseline, and then basically the baseline is 0, which is at the top, and then this is the percent difference in terms of mobility to various things. So it can be work related, it can be parks, it can be residential. So those are the different lines there, and again, can be seen on that website. So using that notion, I'll actually just quickly skip along here because you can actually find the details in the paper. We basically are combining those two to come out with our own measure of adherence by the population. Again, adherence is not necessarily enforcement, so you don't have that factor as well, but it allows, this is a framework, and then you can extend it to have some notion of what the community enforcement was. So let me talk a bit about why we formulated it this way. So some key assumptions. We saw that the average observed mobility versus stringency in the US states, for example, and we started with the US mainly because that was, we were able to get that access to that data first. You can see here visually that there is some sort of decreasing linear relationship, where on the bottom of the axis for the top graph is the stringency, how strict a country imposed NPI events. And as it goes over to the right and increases, that makes it more strict. And then on the y-axis, you have the observed mobility, where the top of the y-axis is 0. And as you come down, it's less and less and less mobility there. So as you kind of would expect, you expect that more stringency would lead to lower mobility. And so that seemed like a reasonable assumption. And then we also looked at the proportion of mobility that was actually greater than the baseline. And it's very, very few. So it's, like 10% or less over time, looking at it for all the categories: workplaces, retail, residential, so forth. And then next, I won't go into details here just for the sake of time. We have a notion of compliance. And once we combine this compliance with stringency, out comes our adherence score. So let me actually skip through that. The details are in the paper. But basically what we've done on the website is where you can see here, the category is transit mobility, things like buses and all of that, subways, those things. We can play over time how well the population adhered to the different MPIs using these different categories of mobility, so that you can also have access to on the website. And let me just, oh, it actually played the video, so let me see. Just a moment. Okay, yeah, so this is just, it went very fast. Here it goes. So that's kind of the color of how well the population adhered to the various MPIs imposed by state over time for March to April 2021. And in the interest of time, I won't go into these details, but I will say that what's been really nice about this work is that we now have collaborations with African universities to explore and understand the impact of COVID-19, both the responses as well as the impact of COVID-19 on non-COVID health-related services. So that work is underway, and happy to discuss that once that starts to come out. Yeah, and just as we wrap up here, I want to thank the team. So we had a kind of very broad global team that worked on this. Again, it was very nice to see NLP and how AI can be in the loop and to support pandemic response and make this a much more scalable and reusable solution. So thank you. Open for questions.
Thank you so much, Aisha. It was a great talk. To be honest, it's amazing to see how we can use AI in NLP to obtain like a data-driven global view of the pandemics and policies introduced, as well as mobility. I'm really impressed by that, and personally, I have many questions to you, but we don't have the time for that. And priority to the people who are asking directly on the web, on Socio. So we have a question from Laban Masunga. So she said, the malaria project caught my attention. It's very impressive. One of the challenges that Africa faces when applying machine learning and AI is the lack of data credibility. I was just wondering, how often do you encounter this in your projects? And how do you handle that? And what are your suggestions for the future and for improvement?
Yeah, so data is always a challenge because machine learning is so data hungry, at least the current set of techniques, not necessarily all of them. For the malaria work, we use reinforcement learning. So we actually use long-standing malaria models from the disease modeling community as the simulation environment. So I think many of you know about games like chess and checkers as your simulation environment. Now imagine a disease model as your simulation environment, where your inputs are the different types of interventions that can be imposed. And that space, of course, is enormous. And then you also obviously have to have your objective function. So that's why it's kind of a platform and then a suite of AI tools. So the platform is to bring the disease modeling community to meet the AI community, because we can leverage the incredible models that they've developed. And then we want to make it easier for policymakers to comb through that vast intervention space. And that's where the reinforcement learning, optimization, and planning methods come in. But yes, data is inherently a challenge. So that was on the malaria side. On the other work, we looked at actually DHS, I think it's the Demographic Health Survey data. It's known to have its own issues and challenges as well, but it allowed us to explore quite a number, tens of countries, and apply various subpopulation analysis methods and as well as sequence mining methods as well.